What happens when rejection becomes the organizing principle of a human life? Toji Fushiguro didn't just experience rejection from his family, he was born as rejection personified, a man with zero cursed energy in a clan that equated cursed energy with humanity itself. His transformation into the Sorcerer Killer wasn't rebellion or career choice. It was the logical endpoint of a psyche, constructed entirely around a void, around absence weaponized into presence. Most viewers interpret Toji as either a tragic victim or a monstrous antagonist, but the psychological reality is far more unsettling. Toji represents what happens when early developmental trauma doesn't destroy you, but instead becomes you, when the wound doesn't heal but instead becomes the foundation upon which you build everything else. Today we're examining the psychological architecture of a man who turned his greatest vulnerability into his defining strength, and what that transformation cost him at the level of basic human functioning. Begin with the paradox that defines everything about Toji's psychology. He possessed no cursed energy in a world where cursed energy determined worth, yet he became powerful enough to kill those who possessed it in abundance. This isn't just ironic narrative construction. It's a precise psychological mechanism called compensation, which Alfred Adler identified as the process by which individuals offset perceived inferiorities by developing related strengths. But Toji didn't compensate. He overcompensated to a pathological degree, achieving what Adler termed superiority through obsessive physical development that allowed him to kill sorcerers, to literally destroy the standard by which he'd been found worthless. This overcompensation wasn't healthy striving. It was adaptive only in the narrowest sense, allowing survival while ensuring he could never develop beyond the identity of someone defined entirely by what he lacked. Every muscle he built, every technique he mastered, every sorcerer he killed was simultaneously proof of his worth and confirmation that he remained psychologically imprisoned by the Zenin clan's original rejection. The Zenin clan didn't just reject Toji. They delivered what developmental psychologists call an ontological rejection, a message that your existence itself violates core values of your community. This represents the most psychologically devastating form of rejection possible because it attacks not behavior or choices, but being itself. Abraham Maslow positioned belonging and esteem as fundamental human needs in his hierarchy, necessary foundations for psychological health. Toji was systematically denied both from birth. He wasn't merely excluded, he was treated as contamination, a stain on clan legacy in a family obsessed with Jujutsu excellence. The psychological literature on rejection sensitivity, developed by researchers studying individuals who experience significant early rejection, describes a pattern where victims develop hypervigilance to further rejection and engage in preemptive hostile behaviors as defense mechanisms. Toji's entire personality structure reflects this pattern taken to its logical extreme. Reject everything before it can reject you, form no attachments that create vulnerability, define yourself entirely through opposition to those who rejected you. Attachment theory illuminates why Toji's relationships followed such pathological patterns. John Bowlby and Mary Ainsworth demonstrated that early relationships with primary caregivers create internal working models shaping all future connections. Consistent rejection from attachment figures produces what researchers classify as avoidant or disorganized attachment styles, characterized by inability to form healthy emotional bonds and expectation that closeness leads inevitably to pain. Watch how this manifests in Toji's relationship with his son Megumi, whom he literally sold to the Zenin clan. Toji couldn't maintain connection with his own child because his internal working model of relationships was fundamentally corrupted. In his psychological framework, love was inextricably linked with rejection and suffering, so the adaptive response was severing bonds before they could become weapons used against him. This wasn't cruelty for its own sake. It was a defense mechanism so deeply embedded that it operated automatically, beneath conscious awareness. Yet here's where Toji's psychology becomes clinically fascinating. Rather than developing the internalized shame and self-loathing typically characterizing rejected individuals, he underwent what Carl Jung called enantiodromia, transformation of something into its opposite. His fundamental lack, his absence of cursed energy, became his greatest weapon not just practically but psychologically. This represents an extreme variant of what psychoanalysts call reaction formation, where the psyche defends against unbearable feelings by adopting their opposite. Toji couldn't tolerate the shame of powerlessness, so his psyche constructed an identity where his lack of cursed energy made him superior, where absence became presence, where rejection became election. This psychological maneuver was brilliant and devastating simultaneously. Brilliant because it allowed him to function without collapsing under shame's weight. Devastating because it locked him into an identity that could never evolve beyond opposition to what rejected him. Sigmund Freud's concept of repetition compulsion explains Toji's career choice with disturbing precision. Repetition compulsion describes the unconscious drive to recreate and master traumatic experiences through symbolic reenactment. Every sorcerer Toji killed was a symbolic murder of the Zenin clan, a repetitive acting out of his original trauma where he finally possessed power his child self lacked. He wasn't killing primarily for money, though mercenary work provided convenient rationalization. He was psychologically compelled to prove repeatedly that those who rejected him were wrong, that he was superior despite or perhaps because of his perceived deficiency. This compulsion appears most transparently in his assassination of the star plasma vessel and confrontation with Gojo Satoru. Gojo embodied the pinnacle of everything Toji could never be, the six eyes and limitless technique representing Jujutsu perfection, making him the perfect target for Toji's compulsive need to destroy what rejected him. Killing Gojo wasn't just a job, it was psychological necessity. Examining Toji through clinical frameworks reveals behavioral patterns consistent with antisocial personality disorder, pervasive disregard for others' rights, failure to conform to social norms, deceitfulness, impulsivity, irritability, consistent irresponsibility, and lack of remorse. But diagnostic labeling misses the crucial point. These traits didn't emerge from inherent evil or biological defect. The etiology of antisocial patterns typically traces to childhood environments characterized by rejection, abuse, and absence of stable attachment figures. Toji's personality structure was an adaptation, perhaps the only adaptation that allowed survival in an environment, teaching him that ruthlessness was the sole viable strategy. He learned early that vulnerability invited exploitation, that emotional expression triggered contempt, that only strength mattered. His personality disorder, if we use that framework, was environmentally induced. A psychological scarring so deep it fundamentally reorganized his capacity for human connection. What makes Toji psychologically brilliant as character construction is his ego-syntonic adaptation. Unlike characters experiencing internal conflict about their actions, Toji achieved a psychological state where his identity as Sorcerer Killer was completely integrated and accepted. He experienced no cognitive dissonance about his lifestyle because he'd constructed a coherent worldview where his actions made perfect sense. In his framework, shaped by years of rejection and contempt, sorcerers were the enemy, society was predatory, only strength mattered, and morality was weakness masquerading as virtue. This worldview, while disturbing, was psychologically functional. It eliminated the pain of existential questions about meaning and ethics. Toji had answered those questions definitively, and his answers, however dark, provided the psychological stability that integration and certainty offer even when the integrated identity is destructive. Jung's shadow concept offers insight into why Toji resonates so powerfully with audiences despite his monstrosity. The shadow represents unconscious personality aspects the conscious ego doesn't identify with, often containing impulses society deems unacceptable. Toji embodies the shadow existing in all of us, the part wanting to strike back at those who hurt us, desiring to prove wrong everyone who doubted us, wishing we could operate without social morality's constraints. Viewers are drawn to Toji not despite his darkness but because of it. He represents the forbidden fantasy of complete liberation from social expectations and the intoxicating power of refusing to internalize others' judgments. His character feels cathartic because he does what our socialized selves forbid. He's the part of us that wants to watch the world that hurt us burn, and watching him enact that fantasy provides vicarious satisfaction while maintaining our moral distance. The trajectory of Toji's development reveals progressive alienation and psychological hardening. The Zenin clan's initial rejection created the core wound, but Toji's response to that wound determined his ultimate path. Resilience research demonstrates that individuals facing adversity develop either adaptive or maladaptive coping strategies. Adaptive strategies might include seeking alternative communities, developing self-worth through different value systems, or engaging in meaning-making transcending the rejection. Toji chose the maladaptive path, constructing his identity entirely in opposition to his rejectors rather than independent of them. This is psychologically crucial because it meant Toji never achieved genuine freedom. He remained enslaved to the Zenin clan, psychologically, even while physically distant, because every action was still defined by them, still a reaction to their rejection. True liberation would have required building an identity based on what he valued, rather than on opposing what rejected him. But his psychology never permitted that developmental leap. His brief period of apparent domesticity, suggested by his relationship with Megumi's mother, raises a fascinating psychological question. Did Toji experience genuine attachment and the possibility of healing core wounds through healthy connection? Or was this interlude merely another manifestation of his fundamental inability to sustain emotional bonds? His immediate reversion to assassin lifestyle after her death and his decision to sell his own son suggests the latter. From trauma psychology perspectives, this demonstrates that single positive relationships, while valuable, cannot fully rewire attachment patterns formed through years of developmental trauma without sustained therapeutic intervention and conscious psychological work. Toji lacked both the insight and motivation for such healing. His brief domesticity represented not transformation, but temporary suspension of his default patterns, and when that suspension's conditions disappeared, he snapped back to his baseline like a released spring. The mechanism by which Toji's rage manifested deserves close examination. Unlike explosive reactive anger, Toji's rage was cold, calculated, channeled into exceptional competence. This represents what psychologists call instrumental aggression, violence used purposefully to achieve goals, contrasting with hostile aggression, which is emotionally driven and reactive. Yet beneath Toji's instrumental violence lay an ocean of hostile rage he'd learned to harness and direct with surgical precision. This psychological skill, maintaining emotional control while engaging in extreme violence, typically develops in individuals who experienced environments where emotional expression was dangerous. For Toji, showing vulnerability or emotional pain in the Zenin clan would have invited further contempt, so he learned early to suppress emotional expression while allowing emotion to fuel his physical development. His calm during combat wasn't peace. It was a pressure vessel containing rage so intense that only perfect control prevented detonation. What does Toji's psychology reveal about real human behavior beyond supernatural fiction? His character illustrates the profound, lasting impact of belonging and acceptance on human development. Social psychology research consistently demonstrates that ostracism and rejection activate the same neural pathways as physical pain, and chronic rejection produces fundamental alterations in personality structure and behavioral patterns. Toji represents the extreme endpoint of rejection psychology, but the mechanisms operating in his character operate in all of us to varying degrees. When we feel excluded, our psychology shifts toward defensive, sometimes aggressive postures. When our fundamental worth is questioned, we overcompensate in related domains. When we experience trauma without support or healing, we develop maladaptive coping mechanisms persisting for lifetimes. Toji is what happens when these universal mechanisms operate without any counterbalancing factors, without intervention, without healing, without connection. Toji's story also illuminates toxic masculinity from psychological rather than purely sociological angles. His identity construction relied entirely on physical dominance, emotional suppression, reduction of relationships to transactions, and equation of worth with power. These elements represent culturally reinforced maladaptive masculine ideals taken to their logical extreme. Toji couldn't imagine deriving worth from emotional connection, creative expression, or vulnerable authenticity because his developmental environment taught him these were worthless or dangerous. His psychology demonstrates how cultural masculinity ideals, when combined with rejection and trauma, produce individuals trapped in narrow, ultimately self-destructive identity configurations. He achieved mastery of his body while losing access to his emotional life, achieved power while losing capacity for connection, achieved superiority while ensuring permanent isolation. The final confrontation between Toji and Gojo Satoru transcends physical combat. It was psychological inevitability. Toji had to face Gojo, had to attempt killing the embodiment of everything the Jujutsu world valued, because his entire psychological structure demanded it. His defeat and death, from narrative psychology perspectives, represent the ultimate limitation of identity, built entirely on opposition and resentment. You cannot construct sustainable selfhood on hatred of what you're not. You can only build sustainable selfhood on integration of what you are. Toji never achieved that integration, and his death, while tragic, was psychologically predetermined by his refusal or inability to heal his core wounds. He died as he lived, defined by absence, by opposition, by rejection, transformed into weapon, but never transcended. Understanding Toji Fushiguro's psychology offers a mirror for examining the rejected, resentful parts of ourselves and our society. His character poses uncomfortable questions about how we treat those who don't fit our definitions of valuable, how rejection shapes human development, and whether redemption is possible for those who've constructed entire identities around their wounds. Jujutsu Kaisen suggests a complex answer. Toji achieved a form of redemption in his final moments with Megumi, yet this redemption came only at death's threshold, suggesting some psychological patterns, once established, become nearly impossible to fundamentally alter. This isn't nihilistic. It's realistic about the profound challenge of psychological healing and the critical importance of early intervention when individuals experience rejection and trauma. By the time Toji's patterns solidified, the window for transformation had likely closed. His psychology had calcified around the original wound. If this examination of Toji's psychology resonated with you, if it shifted how you perceive this character, or helped you understand the psychological mechanisms driving human behavior, please hit that like button and subscribe for more psychological analyses of your favorite anime characters. Drop a comment below telling me what character you'd like analyzed next, or sharing your thoughts about Toji's psychology. What drives the Sorcerer Killer? Is he victim of circumstances or responsible for his choices? Let's discuss in the comments, and remember, understanding fictional characters' psychology helps us better understand real human psychology, including the rejected, resentful parts of ourselves we'd rather not acknowledge.